What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. And specifically, welcome back to Horror Stew. That's right, guys. It is Friday. First of all, happy Friday. Second of all, hope you guys had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We wanted to continue to put out videos over this period of time. And today, of course, is no exception. Today is Friday. So hope you guys are having a wonderful time. That being said, today's episode of Horror Stew is a follow-up to last week's. Last week, we talked about the Resident Evil franchise. We specifically went through and I ranked the mainline titles of the Resident Evil franchise in the order that I deemed them worthy. That being said, I spoke briefly about wanting to talk about the offshoot and the spin-off titles as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about the spin-off Resident Evil titles. And this could be anything from something crazy like a rail shooter, such as Umbrella Chronicles or Darkside Chronicles, all the way up to the disappointment that was the Umbrella Corps. Irregardless, I have 11 spots. I grouped some of these games together, but I have 11 spots, and we're going to give them out here. So let's get us started with ranking the offshoot and spin-off titles of Resident Evil. All right, folks, we're going to top us off here at number 11 with Operation Raccoon City. So I've talked about this in the last video, as well as I talked about this in a previous Control Over C video, where I talked about how much I hate it. So I'm not even going to talk about it. It was released in 2012, disliked it, nothing good, nothing redeeming. That's number 11. Number 10. We have Umbrella Corps. So Umbrella Corps, for people who don't know, was actually supposed to be an anniversary gift from Capcom to us for the Resident Evil franchise. And it was garbage. It was supposed to be a team tactical shooter that was supposed to work around zombies and other entities of the game. You know, there were the Ganados and other enemies from the mainline series. And it was a good idea, but poorly executed. The game was buggy, it was glitchy, not that great. It was released in 2016, so it has really great graphics and really great game mechanics, but it's just not a quality game. There are a lot of things that could be done better, and simply speaking, it's going to be at number 10 for me because I've played it, not impressed. Number 9. Number 9 is the rail shooters. So the reason I'm putting this at number 9 is not because I did not enjoy the rail shooters. In fact, 2007's Umbrella Chronicles and 2009's Darkside Chronicles are both fantastic games. They're a lot of fun, and they are very reminiscent of the original Resident Evil games because they are retelling those stories. But it is a rail shooter. Rail shooters are not as difficult as people think they are to make, and there really wasn't much work to be done on this except for retelling old stories. This is not a bad thing. There are new content and other information pieces that are provided to us, such as Wesker's journey after he was quote-unquote killed by the Tyrant, as well as a prequel to Resident Evil 4 and the story of Jack Krauser. However, these games aren't really that special because all they are arcade games, essentially. Irregardless, that's my number 9, leading us to number 8, Resident Evil Gaiden of 2001. So if you've never played Gaiden, you're not really missing much. Resident Evil Gaiden was a Game Boy Color game from 2001. You heard that right, there was a Game Boy Color game. In fact, there was actually supposed to be a Resident Evil 1 remake for the Game Boy Color as well. There are mods and actual versions of this game online that you can find and play. They were, of course, never officially released, and they've been worked on by different individuals to make them more playable. But Resident Evil Gaiden was a full-made game for the Game Boy Color. It was a very interesting game, interesting concept. You play as Leon S. Kennedy, and it could be worse, but it definitely could be better. Game Boy Color obviously has some very large system limitations because it is a small console, and you are essentially playing on a handheld device. Obviously, in later years, we would get mobile games. For instance, the Resident Evil Revelations and the Mercenaries 3D, which would expand on the ability and possibility of a mobile game. There was also the DS remake of Deadly Silence, which was essentially a remake of the first Resident Evil game. Irregardless, Resident Evil Gaiden has number 8 spot, which says a lot that a Game Boy Color game is above the likes of Umbrella Chronicles and Operation Raccoon City. That being said, number 7 is Mercenaries 3D. This was essentially a remake and a buff of the Mercenaries mode. that has been popularized throughout the series. It was released in 2011. It was a mobile device for the DS, I believe. Great, interesting game. Obviously, there wasn't anything extra special about it. It was a PvP type game where you could face off against other people as these different Resident Evil characters, as well as fighting against different enemies and whatnot. However, nothing special there for it. It is essentially just a rebuff of previous games and previous mercenary modes, and the characters and everything else were essentially the same. Irregardless, it's still fun. It's interesting to try, and I would still recommend you try it if you want to have a little bit of fun. But you're definitely not missing anything by not playing it. There's no crazy story element that you're not seeing by not playing this game. That being said, we're going to move on to number 6, which is Resident Evil Survivor 2. Resident Evil Survivor 2 is essentially a retelling of basically it's a retelling of Code Veronica, but a first-person shooter. See, in the early 2000s, because Survivor 2 was in 2000, and there was another game with a similar name in 2001, but first and foremost, 2001 Survivor 2 was essentially their attempt at making a first-person Resident Evil game. That being said, this game, it was just what it was. Survivor 2 was a first-person shooter game. It had similar mechanics to other Survivor, like for instance Survivor 1. However, it was retelling the story of Code Veronica in a more room-to-room, dungeon-based type game. So it wasn't horrible, wasn't great, and in fact, it wasn't even really released in the United States. It was released in the EU as well as in Japan. So it's not by no means a bad game, but really it's hard for you and I as U.S. citizens, I guess, to really give a true take on this, since all I've played are essentially emulations of the game. But that being said, we're heading into our top 5. So stick around. Let's do this. Now we are in our top 5. The top 5 is the big leagues, boys. The big leagues. Number 5, we have Resident Evil Survivor 1. So if you've never played Resident Evil Survivor, then you really won't know the special experience that you get with Resident Evil Survivor. It is a first-person only game of Resident Evil. There are obviously other first-person games that have come out in more recent times, such as Resident Evil 7, which is such a success. But we wouldn't have Resident Evil 7 if we didn't have Resident Evil Survivor. Resident Evil Survivor was released in 2000, and it is the story of Ark Thompson. This story takes place on a separate island outside of, I believe, Raccoon City. And it quite frankly, it's actually not a bad game. Now, obviously, it does suffer from the fact that it was made in the 2000s, and specifically 2000, and you are working on a much less developed system of point and click. In fact, it was more of a spin around on the analog stick and then hit X to shoot. Now, obviously, this was a very interesting take on the Resident Evil franchise. They were definitely trying to build off the success of the first couple of games, and since this was released in 2000, it is one of the more earlier titles in the genre. That being said, Survivor 1 does have a special place in my heart because it is very interesting to play. It's very interesting to see and hear about. It has a very interesting position as a part of the history of Resident Evil. But irregardless, moving on to number 4, we have Resident Evil Dead Aim. Resident Evil Dead Aim is probably one of the best Resident Evil offshoot games, if it were not for the fact that it is first person. This was another attempt at first person in 2002. We had 2000, 2001, and 2002 with Survivor, Survivor 2, and Dead Aim, where they had 3 consecutive years of trying to make first person shooter Resident Evil work. Now, Dead Aim did do something different. They understood that with the modernization of graphics and the success of other entries such as Code Veronica, that third person does generally work. So they did a weird, interesting take that honestly is what gives it the number 4 spot, in my opinion. Not only does it have an interesting story and interesting enemies and new developments on old characters, but Dead Aim also introduces a very interesting system of third-person interaction and walking, but first-person combat. So you could easily run and evade enemies in third person, and you can have that third-person camera angle because it is fixed camera angles. So you do have the ability of being able to see your surroundings and the things around you. But then when you go into combat mode, you do have to focus on what's in front of you because it is first person. That being said, Dead Aim could have been better, and I feel like if they were to give it a fair shake and go back and make it a remake, definitely I would venture to guess we would see a much more positive recreation of that. So I definitely think it could be better, and I think that in the modern age of remakes and everything else that we're doing, Dead Aim would be a good one to remake, and I feel like it would surprise us with how successful it could be. That being said, we're moving on to number 3. Now, like earlier, I did combine the rail shooters. I'm doing the same thing with my number 3 pick, because Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and File 2 are both fantastic games. They are, however, a part of the same storyline. Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and 2 are essentially a retelling of what I would say are background characters of the Resident Evil games. You get to go through all of the infamous places of the Resident Evil franchise. The hospital in Resident Evil 3, the RPD station in Resident Evil 2 and 3, as well as other areas that are adjacent to the other games. So it is very interesting to see sort of the background, see some of the behind the scenes of the other games, and to also kind of see what the normal citizens and survivors of Raccoon City were having to do to survive. Now, obviously, this game does follow sort of different characters who, for lack of a better phrase, don't really have defined, established backstories, because they're just background characters. But regardless, Outbreak File 1 and 2 do obviously provide a very interesting perspective, because you have a lot of characters to choose from. It gives it a more of an RPG-esque take, because each character has their own skill set, and honestly, that's part of the challenge. Irregardless, this was also some of the games that were multiplayer in the early days of multiplayer. You could play with other people on this game, and there's even an online capability option. So it was one of the first games in the Resident Evil franchise to ever do this, and in addition to that, it was kind of a pioneer of its time. Obviously, this led us to have future games such as Umbrella Chronicles and Operation Raccoon City, but I genuinely think that if we were to remake Outbreak, that we would definitely see a huge wave of people wanting to play an actually good multiplayer Resident Evil game. Don't get me started on Resistance. Irregardless, moving up to number 2, we have Resident Evil Revelation 1 in 2012. Resident Evil Revelation is great in the fact that it is a very interesting take, and it is very good for the fact that this story is being told on a mobile device. The 3DS was what this game's primary console was, and I definitely think that had they made it for a console and then ported it to a smaller device, we probably would have had a better game. But it was the opposite way around. Started on the mobile device and then was ported to the Xbox 360 and then the PlayStation 3 at the time. Not saying this wasn't a good game. There are obviously limitations to what can be put into a Nintendo console title, so they obviously wouldn't put certain amounts of graphicness and blood and gore. Obviously, there was still some. The zombies and some of the monsters were absolutely petrifying to look at, and it honestly gave us a fresh take on some old characters. That being said, leading us up into number 1 is Resident Evil Revelations 2 in 2015. Resident Evil Revelations 2 honestly really surprised me, because the game definitely takes it from a very different perspective. We're being presented with an entirely new storyline, but honestly, it brought back one of those characters that we saw so little of, and it honestly breathed into them new life. We got to see a whole new story with a very famous character from Resident Evil 1, which was Barry Burton. And the crazy thing to me is that Barry Burton was not in any of the other games, basically up until this point. He was in a different cutscene for Resident Evil 3, but outside of his appearance in Resident Evil 1 and that cutscene in Resident Evil 3, he really didn't have any solid appearances anywhere else, or as a playable character. He obviously wasn't even a playable character in Resident Evil 1. However, in Resident Evil Revelations 2, we're finally given a chance to look through the eyes of Barry Burton, and we're able to see the story and the connection between him and Claire, and also him and his daughter, Moira. So this is very interesting as a game to see these different connections and see characters that we've never seen together. And honestly, Resident Evil Revelations 2 has an incredible amount of replayability. It does offer a different game mode that is very RPG-esque, where you can attach different things to improve your stats, to improve your ability to move through different scenarios, whether it be survival or time or goal-based. And it offers a lot of replayability with the story mode as well, because there are customizable items for the main game as well as side games. So overall, Revelations 2 is just an incredible overtake of what Resident Evil was, and I think it definitely led us with success to the more modern games that we see today, such as 7 and the remakes of 2 and 3. Irregardless, Resident Evil Revelations is, I would say, a cornerstone of what a spin-off game should be. So by all means, go play that because you won't be disappointed. But that being said, we're heading into our final thoughts, so let's go ahead and get this going. Final thoughts. Oh man, what can I say except for I love Resident Evil? You know, as much as I talk shit about certain Resident Evil games, I still love playing those games. The only game that I would say that I cannot stand is Operation Raccoon City. Operation Raccoon City was just one of those games that really rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it's just my experience with it. I am sure other people may have enjoyed it. But, you know, every other game that I've ever played in the Resident Evil franchise has given me a certain amount of joy. Even if the games are horrible, you know. Obviously, Umbrella Corps is not very great. It's a very buggy, glitched out mess. But it does offer a very unique approach to what Resident Evil could be. And you not only that, there are some games on this list that I think a lot of people would agree are not that great, such as Resident Evil Gaiden or maybe even the Survivor games. But when you go back and you play it from a futuristic perspective, because, you know, these games were released upwards of 20 years ago, it's definitely interesting to look at them with today's mindset and say, this is where we were in gaming at that time, and this is what could be enjoyed. Irregardless of that, it is incredible to me that Resident Evil has not only spawned, you know, how many main list titles, 11 main list titles, including remakes, as well as Code Veronica. And actually, this is a fun fact as well. I did not include Code Veronica in either the spin-offs or the main title games. And you're probably wondering why. I honestly don't know where to put Code Veronica, and at some point I will actually do a video about my opinions and feelings about Code Veronica, because I don't think it's a mainline title. It's not one of your main sequence titles. It's not 1, 2, 3, 0, blah, blah, blah. It's not even a spinoff, because it holds certain important elements to the main story, but it's also not, you know, not continuous with the main storyline titles. You know, there's not a specific statute that I can actually put in there to say, this is the reason why it's a mainline title. Yes, it is a follow-up to the events of Resident Evil 2. However, it's really never truthfully and fully recognized in the latter parts of the series. So it's hard for me to actually put it in either listing, which is why I'm going to do a separate video on it. Irregardless, these spin-off titles are an impressive amount of work and dedication from the Resident Evil team for decades. I mean, we have mainline titles going all the way back to the 90s. And then we have main spin-off and mainline titles that are going all the way through up until 2021. It is incredible to me that we have almost 25 years worth of Resident Evil and we're still going strong. So I'm going to stop ranting about Resident Evil. I love Resident Evil so much, and I will continue to do videos about it. And in fact, I will probably next week do my video on Code Veronica, because, quite frankly, I love Code Veronica in some ways, and I also hate it in some ways. So that's what we're going to do next week. So for right now, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like, a subscribe, share us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you have that you want to share us. Go ahead and share us. I love it. If you want to get in touch with us online, you can get a hold of us on YouTube, of course. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. Go to Twitter. Twitter is at geek_stew. Facebook is at facebook.com/trythestew. And of course, let us know what you think. Leave us a comment, leave us a tweet, leave us a Facebook post, comment on our Facebook, do whatever you want. Just check us out. That's all that matters. But for right now, guys, hope you enjoyed your holiday. Hope you guys are staying safe. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and keep on growing. See you guys in the next one.